Imagine thinking your worst nightmare is finally behind you, only to discover it was just the beginning. Picture yourself believing you're safe, that the danger has passed, that you can finally breathe again. Then, suddenly, the distant sound of helicopter blades cuts through the silence, growing louder, more urgent, more terrifying with each passing second. This isn't a movie. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who thought she had escaped the most dangerous chapter of her life, only to find herself at the center of a military operation that would change everything she believed about survival, courage, and the price of truth. What started as a simple hiking trip in the remote mountains of Afghanistan became a nightmare that lasted 3 years. What she thought was her rescue became the beginning of an even deadlier game. And what she discovered about the people trying to save her would shake her faith in everything she once believed. This is her story, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely true. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that accepting a photography assignment in Afghanistan would become the defining moment of her life. At 28, she was an accomplished travel photographer, with a reputation for capturing the beauty in the world's most challenging places. Her portfolio included stunning images from war-torn regions, remote villages, and forgotten corners of the earth where few dared to venture. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. A National Geographic editor had commissioned her to document the daily lives of women in rural Afghan villages, focusing on their resilience and strength in the face of ongoing conflict. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work that had drawn her to photography in the first place. She wanted her images to tell stories that mattered, to show the human face behind the headlines. Sarah spent weeks preparing for the trip. She studied the region extensively, learned basic phrases in Dari and Pashto, and connected with local guides who could help her navigate the complex cultural landscape. She understood the risks involved, but her passion for storytelling outweighed her fears. This was her chance to make a real difference, to give voice to women whose stories rarely reach the outside world. Her journey began in Kabul, where she met with local contacts and finalized her plans. The capital city buzzed with a nervous energy that she had experienced in other conflict zones. There was beauty mixed with tension, hope intertwined with uncertainty. She spent several days acclimatizing to the environment and building trust with the people who would help make her project possible. From Kabul, Sarah traveled to a remote village nestled in the Hindu Kush Mountains, about 200 kilometers northeast of the capital. The village, home to roughly 300 people, had remained relatively isolated from the worst of the fighting that plagued other regions. Local leaders had agreed to let her document their community, provided she respected their customs and traditions. The first few weeks went better than she had dared to hope. The women of the village gradually warmed to her presence, sharing their stories and allowing her to photograph moments of their daily lives. She captured images of mothers teaching their daughters traditional crafts, elderly women sharing wisdom around cooking fires, and young girls playing games that had been passed down through generations. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the strength and dignity of these women. Despite facing enormous challenges, they had created a sense of community and purpose that was both inspiring and humbling. Their faces told stories of loss and hardship, but also of hope and determination. She knew that these photographs would become some of the most important work of her career. As the weeks passed, Sarah became more comfortable in her surroundings. She learned to navigate the unwritten rules of village life and developed genuine friendships with several of the women. They taught her to prepare traditional meals, shared family stories, and included her in celebrations and ceremonies that few outsiders had ever witnessed. The work was progressing beautifully, and Sarah began to believe that she might actually complete the project without encountering the violence that plagued so much of the region. She had heard distant sounds of conflict from time to time, but the village had remained peaceful and secure. The local militia that provided protection seemed competent and professional, and the village elders assured her that they had agreements in place to keep their community safe. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late October. Sarah was preparing for another day of photography when she heard the sound of vehicles approaching the village. This was unusual, as few outsiders ever visited the remote community. She looked out from the window of the small house where she was staying and saw a convoy of military vehicles creating dust clouds on the mountain road below. At first, she assumed they might be government forces on a routine patrol. Such visits were rare but not unheard of in rural areas where officials needed to maintain some presence. However, as the vehicles drew closer, Sarah noticed that something was different about these soldiers. Their equipment looked newer and more sophisticated than what she had seen from government forces, and their movement suggested a level of training and coordination that seemed unusual. The village leader, an elderly man named Hassan, who had been one of Sarah's strongest supporters, approached her house with a look of concern that immediately put her on edge. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety, and he spoke in urgent, hushed tones with the other men who accompanied him. Hassan explained that these were not government soldiers, but members of a militant group that had been expanding their territory in recent months. They had been demanding tribute from villagers throughout the region, and those who refused to cooperate faced severe consequences. The village had managed to avoid their attention until now, but that period of safety appeared to be ending. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications of what Hassan was telling her. She was an American woman in a remote village that was about to be occupied by hostile forces. Her presence would likely make the situation even more dangerous for the villagers who had welcomed her into their community. She needed to leave immediately, but there was nowhere to go. The vehicles reached the village within minutes of Hassan's warning. Sarah watched from inside the house as armed men took positions throughout the community. They moved with military precision, securing key locations and establishing control points. This was clearly not their first time taking over a village. Several of the militants approached Hassan and the other village elders, demanding to speak with them immediately. Sarah could see the fear in the faces of the women and children who had become her friends over the past month. They understood what this occupation might mean for their community, and they were powerless to stop it. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the militants intended to establish a permanent presence in the village. They began questioning residents about their activities and allegiances, searching homes for weapons or evidence of cooperation with government forces. Sarah remained hidden in her house, hoping that her presence might go unnoticed in the chaos of the occupation. Unfortunately, her hopes were quickly dashed. One of the militants had noticed the photography equipment in her house during their search, and word quickly spread that there was a foreign journalist in the village. Within hours of their arrival, armed men surrounded her house and demanded that she come outside. Sarah knew that she was facing the moment she had always feared might come during her work in conflict zones. She had taken precautions and followed security protocols, but there was no way to prepare for being trapped in a village during a militant takeover. She gathered her courage, collected her most important belongings, and stepped outside to face whatever was waiting for her. The militant leader was a man in his 40s, with cold eyes and a bearing that suggested extensive military experience. He spoke broken English and made it clear that Sarah's presence in the village was both unexpected and unwelcome. He questioned her about her work, her contacts in Afghanistan, and her connections to Western governments and military forces. Sarah tried to explain that she was simply a photographer documenting the lives of rural women, but the militant leader remained suspicious. He confiscated her cameras and memory cards, along with her satellite phone and other communication equipment. She was told that she would be held while they decided what to do with her, and that any attempt to escape would result in severe punishment for both her and the villagers who had helped her. The next several hours passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. Sarah was confined to a small room in the village school, while the militants consolidated their control over the community. She could hear shouting and occasional gunfire from outside, and she knew that the peaceful existence she had witnessed over the past month was being destroyed. As evening approached, the militant leader returned with news that would change everything. He informed Sarah that she was now a prisoner of their organization, and that her fate would depend on the response of the American government to their demands. She had become a bargaining chip in a larger conflict that she barely understood. Sarah realized that her nightmare was just beginning. The assignment that was supposed to showcase the strength and resilience of Afghan women had instead made her a pawn in a deadly game, with stakes she could not have imagined. She thought about her family back home, about the life she had built as an independent photographer, and about the possibility that she might never see any of it again. That night, as she lay on the hard floor of her makeshift prison, Sarah tried to process what had happened to her. She had always known that her work involved risks, but she had believed that her good intentions and professional conduct would provide some protection. Now she understood how naive that belief had been. The sound of helicopters in the distance caught her attention just before dawn. At first, she allowed herself to hope that it might be a rescue mission, that somehow the authorities had learned of her situation and were coming to help. But as the sound faded without any sign of intervention, she realized that she was truly on her own. Sarah did not know that this would be the first of many times she would hear those helicopter sounds over the coming months. She did not know that her capture was about to trigger a series of events that would involve special forces operations, international negotiations, and covert missions that would blur the lines between rescue and something far more dangerous. Most importantly, she did not know that the people who would eventually try to save her might pose an even greater threat to her survival than her captors ever could. The first month of Sarah's captivity blurred into a haze of fear, uncertainty, and small acts of survival. Her captors moved her frequently between different locations in the mountainous region, never staying in one place long enough for her to establish any sense of routine or safety. She learned to recognize the sounds that meant they would be moving again. Hushed conversations in the early morning hours, the rustle of equipment being packed, and the distant rumble of vehicles being prepared for another journey. Each new location brought fresh challenges and terrors. Sometimes she was held in abandoned buildings that echoed with the ghosts of their former inhabitants. Other times, she found herself confined in caves carved into mountainsides, where the constant drip of water and the scurrying of unseen creatures marked the passage of endless hours. The worst locations were the underground bunkers, where artificial lighting cast strange shadows and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of desperation. Sarah's captors were a mixed group of fighters from different backgrounds and motivations. Some were hardened veterans who treated her with cold professionalism, viewing her simply as a valuable asset to be protected and used when necessary. Others were younger men who seemed uncomfortable with holding a Western woman prisoner, occasionally showing small kindnesses that she learned not to depend upon. The leader who had first captured her remained a constant presence throughout her ordeal. He called himself Commander Rashid, though Sarah suspected this was not his real name. Rashid spoke English well enough to conduct the interrogations that became a regular part of her routine. He was intelligent and calculating, always probing for information that might prove useful to his organization. During these sessions, Rashid questioned Sarah extensively about her contacts in the United States, her knowledge of military operations in Afghanistan, and her connections to other journalists and aid workers. She tried to convince him that she was simply a photographer with no access to sensitive information, but he remained skeptical of her claims. He seemed convinced that any American working in Afghanistan must have some connection to intelligence or military operations. Sarah quickly learned that honesty was her best strategy for survival. She answered questions truthfully whenever possible, while being careful not to provide information that might endanger others. She told Rashid about her photography career, her previous assignments, and her reasons for coming to Afghanistan. She provided details about her family and background that could be easily verified, hoping to build some measure of trust. The psychological pressure of captivity was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The constant uncertainty about her fate, combined with the isolation from any familiar faces or voices, began to wear on her mental health. She found herself having conversations with imaginary companions, reliving memories from her childhood, and creating elaborate fantasies about rescue scenarios that would probably never come to pass. Sleep became both a refuge and a torment. In her dreams, Sarah often found herself back home in Colorado, working in her studio or hiking in the mountains she loved. These dreams were so vivid and comforting that waking up to the reality of her situation became a daily trauma. She learned to treasure those few moments between sleep and full consciousness when she could still pretend that the nightmare was not real. Food was a constant concern during her captivity. Her captors provided basic sustenance, but the quality and quantity varied dramatically depending on their circumstances and resources. Sometimes she received meals that were almost adequate, including rice, vegetables, and occasional protein. Other times, she survived on little more than bread and tea for days at a time. The irregular eating schedule and poor nutrition began to take a visible toll on her physical condition. Sarah's requests for medical attention were largely ignored by her captors. She developed a persistent cough that worried her, and several minor injuries from her rough living conditions never received proper treatment. She began to understand how quickly the human body could deteriorate under such conditions, and she worked to maintain her physical strength through whatever exercise was possible in her confined spaces. Communication with the outside world was strictly controlled and infrequent. Occasionally, Rashid would allow her to record brief video messages that would be used in negotiations with authorities. These sessions were carefully scripted and monitored, giving Sarah little opportunity to provide information about her location or condition. She knew that her family was probably seeing these videos, and she tried to appear as strong as possible for their sake. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her captivity to endure. Sarah had always been a social person who drew energy from interaction with others. Being cut off from meaningful human connection was slowly eroding her sense of self and purpose. She found herself talking to the walls, creating elaborate stories about the lives of her guards, and desperately analyzing every small interaction for signs of hope or danger. After about 6 weeks in captivity, Sarah began to notice changes in the behavior of her captors that suggested something significant was happening. There were more frequent communications on their radios, increased security measures, and a general sense of heightened alertness that had not been present before. She wondered if negotiations for her release might be progressing, or if external pressures were making her captors more nervous about holding her. The answer came during one of her regular interrogation sessions with Rashid. He informed her that American forces were actively searching for her location, and that several operations had come close to finding their hiding places. This was both encouraging and terrifying news for Sarah. While she desperately wanted to be rescued, she also understood that military operations in her vicinity could easily result in her death if something went wrong. Rashid seemed genuinely concerned about the increasing pressure from American forces. He explained that her value as a prisoner was diminishing if holding her became too dangerous for his organization. Sarah realized with growing dread that her captors might decide that she was more troubled than she was worth, and that such a decision would likely not end well for her. The helicopter sounds that had become a constant backdrop to her captivity grew more frequent and came closer to their locations. Sometimes the aircraft would circle overhead for extended periods, clearly searching for something or someone in the area. Sarah learned to distinguish between different types of helicopters based on their sound signatures, and she began to hope that the American military was indeed getting closer to finding her. However, her hopes were tempered by a growing understanding of the complexity of her situation. Through overheard conversations and fragments of information from her guards, Sarah began to piece together a broader picture of the conflict surrounding her captivity. She learned that her case had become part of larger political negotiations involving prisoner exchanges, territorial concessions, and strategic considerations that went far beyond her individual circumstances. This realization was both sobering and frightening. Sarah understood that she might remain a prisoner not because her captors particularly wanted to hold her, but because releasing her could complicate other aspects of the ongoing conflict. She was trapped in a web of political and military calculations that she could not influence or control. As winter approached in the mountains, Sarah's living conditions became even more challenging. The buildings and caves where she was held offered little protection from the harsh weather, and her captors seemed to have limited resources for heating or adequate winter clothing. She spent long hours huddled under thin blankets trying to conserve body heat and energy. The cold weather also seemed to affect the mood and behavior of her captors. They became more irritable and less communicative, and Sarah sensed that the stress of evading American forces while maintaining their operations was taking a toll on the entire organization. This created an atmosphere of tension and unpredictability that made her feel even more vulnerable. One particularly cold night in December, Sarah was awakened by the sound of intense helicopter activity overhead. The aircraft seemed to be circling their position for an unusually long time, and she could hear her guards speaking in urgent, worried tones. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that rescue might finally be at hand. Instead, the helicopters eventually moved on without any attempt at intervention. Sarah later learned from overheard conversations that the aircraft had been conducting surveillance rather than a rescue operation. The knowledge that American forces knew approximately where she was being held, but were not yet ready to attempt a rescue, was somehow more frustrating than complete ignorance would have been. As her third month in captivity began, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the way her captors treated her. There was less attention to her basic needs, fewer conversations during meals, and a general sense that her guards were becoming emotionally detached from her situation. She began to worry that these changes might be preparation for something final and irreversible. The uncertainty about her future became almost unbearable. Sarah found herself cycling through emotions of hope, despair, anger, and resignation on a daily basis. She created mental exercises to keep her mind sharp and composed, elaborate plans for escape scenarios that she knew were probably impossible to execute. Most importantly, she tried to maintain some sense of hope that her story would not end in these remote mountains. Little did Sarah know that her situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. The American forces searching for her were not just military personnel, but included special operations units with their own agendas and methods. The rescue operation that was being planned would involve risks and decisions that could easily result in her death, even if the mission was technically successful. Moreover, Sarah had no way of knowing that her captors were beginning to suspect that she might be more than just a photographer. Radio intercepts and intelligence gathered from captured communications suggested that American forces were investing unusual resources in finding her. This level of attention was making Rashid wonder if Sarah might have connections or knowledge that she had not revealed during her interrogations. As the winter deepened and the sounds of helicopters continued to echo through the mountains, Sarah prepared herself for whatever would come next. She had survived 3 months of captivity, but she sensed that the most dangerous part of her ordeal was still ahead of her. The game of cat and mouse between her captors and her potential rescuers was escalating, and she remained trapped in the middle with no control over her own fate. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had seen enough hostage situations to know that most of them ended badly for everyone involved. As the leader of SEAL Team 7's hostage rescue unit, he understood the delicate balance between speed, precision, and overwhelming force that these operations required. When he received the briefing about Sarah Mitchell, he immediately knew this mission would be different from anything his team had attempted before. The intelligence picture surrounding Sarah's capture was fragmented and constantly changing. Satellite imagery showed multiple potential locations where she might be held, but the mountainous terrain and frequent movement by her captors made it nearly impossible to maintain continuous surveillance. Human intelligence assets in the region provided conflicting reports about her condition and exact whereabouts. Most frustratingly, intercepted communications suggested that her captors were well aware of American efforts to locate her. Morrison's team had been conducting surveillance and reconnaissance operations in the region for over 2 months without success. They had tracked Sarah's captors through 6 different locations, always arriving just hours or days after the group had moved on. The militants were clearly experienced at evading detection and had established sophisticated networks for communication and supply that made them extremely difficult to pin down. The political pressure surrounding Sarah's case was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in his 15-year military career. Her capture had received significant media attention in the United States, and her family had been working tirelessly to keep her story in the public eye. Congressional representatives were demanding regular updates on rescue efforts, and senior military officials were clearly feeling the heat from their civilian leadership. This political dimension added layers of complexity to what was already an extremely challenging operational environment. Morrison's team was not only fighting against skilled adversaries in difficult terrain, but they were also operating under intense scrutiny from officials who had never conducted a hostage rescue operation themselves. Every decision was analyzed and second-guessed, making it difficult to maintain the flexibility and initiative that special operations required. The intelligence officer assigned to Morrison's team was Captain Lisa Chen, a brilliant analyst who specialized in tracking terrorist and insurgent networks. Chen had been studying Sarah's captors for months, building detailed profiles of their leadership, operational patterns, and psychological motivations. Her analysis would prove crucial to understanding how to approach the rescue operation. According to Chen's research, Commander Rashid was a former Afghan army officer who had defected to the insurgency several years earlier. He was intelligent, well-trained, and extremely cautious about operational security. His group operated more like a professional military unit than a typical terrorist cell, which explained their success at evading capture. Most importantly for the rescue mission, Rashid had a history of executing prisoners when he felt threatened by military operations. This last piece of information created a fundamental dilemma for Morrison's team. Standard hostage rescue procedures emphasized speed and surprise to minimize the risk that captors would harm their prisoners during an assault. However, Rashid's psychological profile suggested that any rescue attempt, regardless of how it was conducted, might trigger him to kill Sarah before the team could reach her. They needed to find a way to neutralize this threat while still maintaining the element of surprise. The first major breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A young Afghan interpreter working with American forces had grown up in the same village where Rashid was born, and he recognized the militant leader's voice on intercepted radio communications. This interpreter, who called himself Ahmad, provided detailed information about Rashid's family connections, tribal affiliations, and personal history that helped Chen build a much more complete psychological profile. Ahmad's information revealed that Rashid had a younger brother living in Pakistan who had remained loyal to the Afghan government throughout the conflict. This brother worked as a teacher in a refugee camp and had been sending money to support Rashid's extended family members who had been displaced by the fighting. Chen realized that this family connection might provide leverage that could be used to ensure Sarah's safety during a rescue operation. However, Morrison was reluctant to involve civilian family members in military operations. The ethical implications of threatening or manipulating innocent people to achieve tactical objectives troubled him, and he knew that such actions could have serious legal and political consequences if they became public. His superiors in the chain of command were more pragmatic about these concerns, but Morrison insisted on exploring other options first. The surveillance operation continued for another month, while Morrison's team developed multiple rescue scenarios. They identified 3 locations where Sarah was most likely being held, and they prepared detailed assault plans for each site. The plans involved complex coordination between helicopter insertion teams, ground assault forces, and supporting elements including snipers and communication specialists. Each potential rescue site presented unique challenges that required different tactical approaches. The first location was a compound in a valley that offered excellent fields of fire for defending forces but limited escape routes for Sarah's captors. The second was a cave complex that would require underground fighting in confined spaces, where the advantage would go to defenders who knew the terrain. The third was an abandoned village perched on a mountainside that could only be approached from one direction, making surprise nearly impossible to achieve. Morrison's team conducted extensive rehearsals, using mock-ups of each location, built at a training facility in a neighboring country. They practiced the assaults repeatedly, refining their tactics and timing until every team member could execute their role flawlessly, even under the stress of combat conditions. However, all of their preparation would be worthless if they could not locate Sarah's exact position when the time came to launch the operation. The breakthrough they had been waiting for came from an unexpected direction. During a routine surveillance flight, one of their drones captured thermal imagery that showed a group of figures moving between buildings at one of their target locations, in a pattern that suggested they were guarding something or someone important. Analysis of the footage revealed what appeared to be a woman being escorted by armed men, providing the first visual confirmation of Sarah's location in months. Morrison immediately began preparing for the rescue operation, but new intelligence from Chen's sources complicated the situation dramatically. Intercepts of Rashid's communications revealed that he was planning to move Sarah again within the next few days, this time to a location much farther from the Pakistani border, where American forces would have difficulty operating. If they were going to rescue Sarah, they needed to act within the next 48 hours. The accelerated timeline meant that Morrison's team would have to conduct the operation with less preparation and reconnaissance than they would normally require. They would be assaulting a target that they had not been able to study in person, using intelligence that was already several hours old, in an area where weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Every aspect of the mission involved elevated risk levels that pushed the operation beyond normal operational parameters. Senior military officials initially balked at authorizing the mission under such conditions, but the political pressure to rescue Sarah before she disappeared again proved decisive. Morrison received final approval for the operation with the understanding that failure was not an option. His team would have one chance to bring Sarah home, and any mistakes could easily result in her death and the loss of American lives. The final mission briefing took place at a forward operating base less than 50 miles from Sarah's suspected location. Morrison's team included 12 highly trained operators, plus support personnel for communications, medical assistance, and logistics coordination. They would be supported by helicopter gunships, reconnaissance aircraft, and a quick reaction force that could provide backup if the situation deteriorated. Morrison emphasized to his team that their primary objective was to rescue Sarah alive and unharmed. All other considerations, including capturing or killing her captors, were secondary to bringing her home safely. However, he also made clear that they would eliminate any threat to Sarah's safety without hesitation, and that rules of engagement authorized them to use whatever force was necessary to protect her and themselves. As the team conducted final equipment checks and prepared for insertion, Morrison reflected on the complexity of what they were attempting. Hostage rescue operations were among the most difficult and dangerous missions that Special Forces conducted, requiring perfect coordination between multiple teams operating in a high-stress environment, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The weather conditions were deteriorating as evening approached, with cloud cover and wind that would make helicopter operations more dangerous. However, the poor weather might also provide concealment that would help the team approach their target without detection. Morrison made the difficult decision to proceed with the mission despite the environmental challenges. The helicopters lifted off just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, their rotors cutting through air that was growing thicker with moisture and increasingly turbulent from mountain winds. Morrison felt the familiar mix of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every combat operation, amplified by the knowledge that Sarah Mitchell's life hung in the balance of the next few hours. As they flew toward the target area, Morrison reviewed the intelligence one final time and visualized the sequence of events that would need to unfold for the mission to succeed. They would have to land without detection, approach the compound silently, neutralize Sarah's guards before they could harm her, and extract everyone safely under conditions that were far from ideal. Hundreds of things could go wrong, but Morrison focused on what his team could control and tried not to think about the variables that were beyond their influence. Radio chatter from the surveillance aircraft confirmed that there was still activity at the target location, suggesting that Sarah and her captors had not yet moved to their next hiding place. This was encouraging news, but it also meant that the compound was fully occupied and defended, making the assault more dangerous for everyone involved. As the mountains grew larger in the windscreen of their helicopter, Morrison realized that they were about to discover whether months of planning, training, and preparation would be sufficient to overcome the challenges of rescuing a hostage from one of the most difficult operational environments in the world. In a few minutes, they would either be celebrating Sarah's rescue or dealing with consequences that could haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sound of rotors approaching through the mountain air was something Sarah had learned to recognize with painful accuracy during her months of captivity. This time, however, something was different. Instead of the distant reconnaissance flights she had become accustomed to, these helicopters were coming closer and moving with a purposefulness that made her heart race with desperate hope and terrible fear. Rashid burst into her cell with an expression of cold fury that Sarah had never seen before. His usual calculated composure had been replaced by the barely controlled panic of a man who knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. Without explanation, he grabbed Sarah roughly by the arm and began dragging her toward the back of the compound where his men were frantically preparing defensive positions. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare choreographed in slow motion. Sarah heard the distinct crack of rifle fire echoing off the mountain walls, followed by the deeper percussion of explosives that shook dust from the ceiling beams above her head. Rashid shoved her into a small storage room and barricaded the door from the outside, leaving her in complete darkness while chaos erupted throughout the compound. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team had achieved tactical surprise in their initial assault, but the advantage was quickly evaporating as Rashid's men responded with the professionalism of experienced fighters. The compound's defenders had prepared for exactly this scenario, and they were implementing defensive plans that had been rehearsed and refined over months of preparation. Morrison realized within minutes of the assault beginning that they were facing a much more capable enemy than intelligence reports had suggested. The layout of the compound was more complex than satellite imagery had revealed, with hidden passages and prepared fighting positions that allowed the defenders to move between buildings while remaining concealed from the attacking forces. Morrison's team found themselves engaged in a room-to-room battle against enemies who knew the terrain intimately and had no intention of surrendering without extracting a heavy price. Sarah pressed herself against the wall of her makeshift prison, trying to make sense of the sounds of battle raging outside her door. She could hear American voices shouting tactical commands, but she could also hear Rashid's men responding with disciplined fire that suggested they were holding their ground effectively. The rescue operation that should have brought her salvation was turning into a prolonged firefight that could easily end with her death. Morrison quickly realized that his original assault plan was not adequate for the resistance they were encountering. The team had expected to overwhelm the compound's defenses quickly and locate Sarah within the first few minutes of the operation. Instead, they were becoming bogged down in a tactical situation that favored the defenders and threatened to drag on long enough for enemy reinforcements to arrive. The weather conditions that had provided concealment during their approach were now working against Morrison's team. The increasing cloud cover was making it difficult for their supporting aircraft to provide effective fire support, and the wind was interfering with communications between team members who had become separated during the assault. Morrison knew that they were losing the initiative that was crucial to hostage rescue operations. Captain Chen, monitoring the operation from the command center, was receiving reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of the tactical situation. The assault team was taking casualties, ammunition supplies were being consumed more rapidly than planned, and there was still no confirmation of Sarah's exact location within the compound. Most critically, intercepted radio communications suggested that Rashid was preparing to execute his prisoner, rather than allow her to be rescued. Sarah heard footsteps approaching her door, and voices speaking in urgent Arabic that she could not understand completely. She recognized Rashid's voice among the speakers, and the tone of the conversation suggested that they were discussing her immediate fate. She pressed herself further back against the wall and tried to prepare mentally for whatever was about to happen to her. Morrison made the difficult decision to modify the mission parameters in real time. Instead of continuing the systematic room-to-room clearing operation that had been planned, he divided his team into smaller elements that could move more quickly through the compound while accepting higher risks. It was a desperate gamble, but they were running out of time to find Sarah before her captors decided that keeping her alive was no longer worth the cost. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Rodriguez, one of Morrison's most experienced operators, noticed fresh footprints leading to a building that had not been identified as a priority target during mission planning. Following his instincts, Rodriguez approached the building from an unexpected angle and spotted movement through a window that suggested someone was being held inside against their will. Rodriguez called in his discovery just as Rashid was removing the barricade from Sarah's door. The militant leader had apparently decided that the tactical situation was hopeless and that executing his prisoner was the only way to deny the Americans a victory. Sarah heard the door being opened and saw Rashid silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, a pistol in his hand and murder in his eyes. Morrison received Rodriguez's report and immediately redirected his assault toward the building where Sarah was believed to be held. However, the tactical situation was complicated by the fact that approaching the building would require his team to cross open ground under fire from multiple defensive positions. They would have to choose between speed and safety, and either choice could result in Sarah's death. The decision was made for them when Sarah managed to break free from Rashid's grasp and run toward the window of her prison. Her sudden movement caused Rashid to hesitate for the crucial seconds that Rodriguez needed to line up a shot that would neutralize the threat without risking Sarah's life. The precision rifle shot that followed was a testament to Rodriguez's skill and training, but it also triggered a level of violence that neither Sarah nor the rescue team was prepared to handle. Rashid's death caused his remaining fighters to abandon their defensive positions and converge on the building where Sarah was being held. Their intent was no longer to maintain control of the compound, but to ensure that the Americans would not rescue their prisoner alive. Morrison's team found themselves fighting not just to complete their mission, but to protect Sarah from enemies who had nothing left to lose. Sarah found herself in the terrifying position of being caught between the crossfire of two groups of armed men who were trying to kill each other while claiming to protect her. Bullets shattered the windows around her as she tried to find shelter in a room that offered no real protection from the violence erupting throughout the compound. She realized with growing horror that her rescue might actually result in her death. Morrison reached Sarah's location first, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters were attempting to breach the building from multiple directions, and his team was running low on ammunition after the prolonged firefight. Most critically, the extraction helicopters were having difficulty finding a safe landing zone in the compound due to ongoing enemy fire and the challenging weather conditions. The next 20 minutes became a desperate fighting withdrawal as Morrison's team attempted to move Sarah to a location where she could be extracted safely. They were forced to fight their way through multiple defensive positions while protecting a traumatized civilian who was struggling to function effectively under combat conditions. Sarah tried to follow the team's instructions, but months of captivity had left her physically weak and emotionally fragile. The first extraction attempt failed when enemy fire forced the helicopter to abort its landing approach. The pilot reported that the landing zone was too dangerous and that they would need to find an alternative location for pickup. Morrison realized that they would have to move Sarah a considerable distance from the compound while continuing to fight off pursuit from the remaining enemy forces. The mountain terrain that had protected Sarah's captors for months now became an obstacle for the rescue team to overcome. Moving through rocky, uneven ground while carrying equipment and protecting a weakened hostage was exhausting work that slowed their progress significantly. Enemy fighters who knew the terrain intimately were able to track their movement and set up ambush positions that threatened to cut off their escape route. Sarah's physical condition became a critical factor in the success or failure of the extraction operation. Months of poor nutrition and limited exercise had left her unable to maintain the pace that the tactical situation required. Morrison's team was forced to choose between abandoning her to save themselves or accepting casualties while protecting someone who could barely keep up with their movement. The decision was made easier by the arrival of the Quick Reaction Force that had been standing by to provide backup if needed. Additional helicopters and ground forces gave Morrison the resources he needed to establish a secure perimeter around Sarah's location while the extraction was completed. However, the expanded operation also meant that many more American lives were now at risk to save one person. As the extraction helicopter finally lifted off with Sarah on board, Morrison reflected on the cost of what they had accomplished. His team had suffered casualties. American resources had been expended on a massive scale, and the political implications of the operation would continue to reverberate for months. Most troubling was the knowledge that Sarah's rescue was only the beginning of a story that was far from over. During the flight to safety, Sarah began to process what had happened to her during the rescue operation. The violence she had witnessed was unlike anything she had experienced during her months of captivity, and she was struggling to understand how the people who had saved her life had also put her in more danger than she had ever faced before. The men who had risked their lives to rescue her were professional soldiers, but they were also killers who had brought warfare to a level that Sarah was not prepared to handle. As the helicopter carried her away from the mountains where she had been held prisoner, Sarah realized that her ordeal was not ending, but entering a new phase that might prove even more challenging than captivity itself. She had been rescued by people whose methods and motivations she did not understand, and she was beginning to suspect that her value to various parties might extend far beyond her identity as an innocent photographer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The sound of rotor blades that had once represented hope for rescue would continue to echo in Sarah's mind long after she was returned to American custody. She had learned that salvation could be as dangerous as captivity, and that the people claiming to protect her might have agendas that were just as threatening to her survival as anything her captors had planned. Sarah Mitchell should have felt relief as the helicopter carried her away from the mountain compound where she had been held captive for nearly 4 months. Instead, she found herself gripped by a new kind of fear that was somehow more unsettling than anything she had experienced during her captivity. The soldiers who had rescued her were professional and courteous, but there was something in their eyes that suggested her ordeal was far from over. The flight to the American military base took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity to Sarah as she tried to process what had happened during the rescue operation. The violence she had witnessed was extreme, even by the standards of war-torn Afghanistan, and she was beginning to understand that her case had become something much larger than a simple hostage rescue. The resources that had been devoted to finding her, the scale of the operation that had freed her, and the casualties that had been sustained in the process all suggested that her value to various parties extended far beyond her identity as an innocent photographer. Lieutenant Commander Morrison sat across from Sarah during the flight, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She could tell that he was evaluating her condition and trying to determine how much she had learned during her captivity that might be useful for future operations. His questions were carefully phrased and seemed casual, but Sarah recognized the techniques of interrogation that she had experienced with her captors. The military base where Sarah was taken for debriefing was a sprawling complex that buzzed with the constant activity of a major operational center. She was immediately struck by the level of security surrounding her arrival and the number of personnel who seemed to have been involved in planning and executing her rescue. This was clearly not a routine operation, and the attention she was receiving suggested that her case had implications that she was only beginning to understand. Captain Chen was waiting for Sarah when the helicopter landed, and her first impression of the intelligence officer was deeply unsettling. Chen approached her with a smile and warm words of welcome, but her eyes were cold and calculating, in a way that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of Commander Rashid. There was an analytical quality to Chen's attention that made Sarah feel like a specimen being examined, rather than a victim being helped.
The initial medical examination revealed the toll that months of captivity had taken on Sarah's physical condition.
She had lost significant weight, developed several minor infections, and shown signs of malnutrition that would require weeks of treatment to address fully. However, the medical staff seemed more interested in documenting her condition for official reports than in providing comfort or reassurance about her recovery prospects. Sarah's first formal debriefing session took place in a sterile conference room where she was questioned by a team of intelligence officers, military personnel, and civilian contractors whose exact roles and affiliations were never clearly explained to her. The questions they asked were detailed and probing, covering not only her experiences during captivity, but also her background, her reasons for traveling to Afghanistan, and her knowledge of other Americans working in the region. The interrogators were particularly interested in Sarah's observations about Commander Rashid's organization, their operational methods, and their connections to other militant groups in the region. Sarah answered their questions as thoroughly as possible, but she began to sense that her interrogators already knew many of the answers and were testing her honesty rather than seeking new information. This realization was both reassuring and disturbing, as it suggested that American intelligence capabilities were far more extensive than she had realized. As the debriefing sessions continued over several days, Sarah became increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. The interrogators began asking about her photography work in other countries, her contacts in the international media, and her knowledge of other journalists who had worked in similar circumstances. It became clear that they were building a comprehensive profile of her activities and associations that went far beyond what would be necessary for a simple rescue debriefing. Sarah's requests to contact her family were initially denied for security reasons, but she was allowed to record brief messages that would be transmitted to her relatives through official channels. The messages were carefully reviewed before transmission, and she was instructed to avoid discussing specific details of her captivity or rescue. This level of control over her communications was explained as necessary for operational security, but it reminded her uncomfortably of the restrictions her captors had imposed. The living quarters where Sarah was housed during her debriefing were comfortable but clearly designed to prevent her from leaving without permission. The doors could only be opened from the outside, her communications were monitored, and she was accompanied by military personnel whenever she moved around the facility. She was told that these measures were for her own protection, but they felt remarkably similar to the conditions of her captivity. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a military psychologist assigned to evaluate Sarah's mental health, proved to be one of the few people at the facility who seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare rather than her intelligence value. During their sessions together, Reynolds helped Sarah begin to process the trauma of her experiences and provided strategies for coping with the ongoing stress of her situation. However, even these therapeutic sessions were recorded and analyzed for intelligence purposes. Reynolds explained to Sarah that her case had become highly classified due to the sensitive nature of the rescue operation and the intelligence that had been gathered during her captivity. This classification meant that Sarah would be restricted in what she could discuss publicly about her experiences, even after her eventual release from military custody. The implications of this restriction were profound, as it meant that Sarah might never be able to tell her complete story or seek closure through public discussion of her ordeal. The psychological evaluation revealed that Sarah was suffering from symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, panic attacks, and an exaggerated startle response that made it difficult for her to function in normal social situations. Reynolds recommended extensive treatment and a gradual reintegration process that could take months or years to complete successfully. However, the military officials overseeing Sarah's case seemed more concerned with managing the security implications of her condition than with providing optimal treatment. Sarah's family members were eventually allowed to visit her at the military facility, but their interactions were carefully monitored and controlled. Her parents and siblings were clearly relieved to see her alive, but they were also confused and frustrated by the restrictions that prevented them from discussing her experiences or making plans for her future. The reunion that should have been a joyful celebration became another source of stress and uncertainty for everyone involved. During one of their supervised visits, Sarah's father quietly expressed concern about the way she was being treated by military officials. He had hired attorneys to advocate for her rights, but they had been told that national security considerations took precedence over normal legal protections. This conversation was overheard by facility personnel, and Sarah's father was subsequently banned from further visits until he agreed to sign agreements limiting his ability to discuss her case publicly. Sarah began to realize that she had become a valuable intelligence asset whose knowledge of militant operations, rescue techniques, and classified military capabilities made her a potential security risk if she were released without proper safeguards. The photography assignment that had led to her capture was being portrayed as a cover for intelligence-gathering activities, despite her repeated denials of any connection to espionage or covert operations. The most disturbing revelation came during a conversation with Captain Chen about Sarah's future prospects. Chen explained that Sarah's extensive knowledge of sensitive military operations and classified intelligence made it unlikely that she would be allowed to return to her previous career as a freelance photographer. Her travel would be restricted, her communications would be monitored, and her professional activities would be subject to approval by security officials for the foreseeable future. Sarah realized with growing horror that her rescue had transformed her from a prisoner of militants into a prisoner of her own government. The people who had risked their lives to save her were now treating her as a threat that needed to be contained rather than a victim who deserved compassion and support. The freedom she had dreamed of during her months of captivity was proving to be an illusion that masked a different but equally restrictive form of control. The sound of helicopters continued to echo in Sarah's mind as she lay awake in her military quarters. But now the sound represented not hope for rescue, but the machinery of a system that had trapped her in a new kind of nightmare. She had learnt that being saved and being free were not the same thing, and that the people claiming to protect her might pose a greater long-term threat to her independence and dignity than her captors ever had. Morrison visited Sarah one final time before her case was transferred to other authorities for long-term management. He expressed genuine regret about the way her situation had developed, but he also made clear that the requirements of national security would continue to take precedence over her personal desires and needs. He urged her to cooperate fully with the restrictions that would be placed on her life, warning that resistance would only make her situation more difficult. As Sarah contemplated her future from the confines of her military quarters, she understood that her story was not one of rescue and recovery, but of betrayal and ongoing captivity. The helicopter sounds that had once offered hope had delivered her into the hands of people who viewed her not as a human being deserving of freedom, but as an intelligence asset requiring management and control. Sarah's ordeal had taught her that in the modern world of intelligence operations and national security concerns, there was often no clear distinction between victims and threats, between rescue and capture, or between freedom and control. She had survived her physical captivity only to discover that her true prison was built from classified information, security restrictions, and the calculated decisions of people who valued her knowledge more than her humanity. The woman who had once traveled the world documenting the resilience of people in difficult circumstances had become a living example of how easily freedom could be lost and how difficult it could be to regain once the machinery of national security had decided that individual rights were secondary to collective safety. Her camera had been silenced, her voice had been restricted, and her future had been decided by people who would never be held accountable for the human cost of their decisions.